Dragon's Dogma 2 is easily my most anticipated game of the year. I absolutely love the first Dragon's Dogma, flaws and all. This left me a little bit torn on the sequel here, as I felt it was a case of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So who do I think would really get their money's worth out of Dragon's Dogma 2? Well, let's get into it.
You're like to grow overburdened if you keep picking up every little trinket you find. Why are you doing this, Arisen?
Welcome back to JBG. I'm recording during daylight for a change, so let's see how many random dog barks make it post-edit. Today we're talking about Dragon's Dogma 2 on the PS5. Dragon's Dogma 2 is a third-person action RPG from Capcom, a sequel to the 2009 release that slowly became a bit of a cult classic. There's quite a few reasons why it didn't pick up much traction back in the day, and some of those reasons are actually what made it such a loved game even a decade later.
I like it a lot.
By nature, there's going to be some comparisons made since it's a sequel, but as usual, I'm going to try and keep the spoilers to a minimum. There will be some mid to late game footage, so some small contextual spoilers, and I did decide against going over the endgame mechanics, since there's plenty out there to spoil it for you if you really want to. I'm also going to kind of gloss over most of the mechanics. I don't want to go too in-depth for 2 reasons. First being to really break down vocations and how all the mechanics interweave. It could take hours. Second being, one of the best things about this series to me is figuring out how to play within the mechanics and overcome what I like to call tough love progression. I'm also going to get the microtransaction conversation out of the way right here. If you're totally overhearing it, feel free to skip to the next chapter, because frankly, I'm not going to have a popular take on it here. The gaming community showed its over misinformation on the mechanics and how the microtransaction tied into them, even to the point of insulting and harassing people just enjoying the game all over Reddit, Twitter, and Facebook. I know these are the places you look for the lowest intellectual bottom feeders of the human race, but the false narratives miss the important issues about this game that should have actually been at the forefront.
My disappointment is immeasurable, and my day is ruined.
Yes, there are microtransactions. No, they're not required to progress, and absolutely nothing is paywalled like everybody wanted to claim. Anyone who played the first one could point it out before it even launched. No, these microtransactions were not just snuck in. These were discussed weeks before launch, and everybody turned a blind eye to them. And no, I really don't even care that they're in there anymore. I didn't just spend the last year hearing the entire gaming community sucking Capcom's dick over the Resident Evil 4 remake just for them to harass or bully me out of playing something I've been waiting for over a decade, just because they didn't have any personal investment in the franchise. Here's the hard truth. Microtransactions will be around forever because people buy microtransactions, not because people ignore them and still buy a game. I also have no intention of contributing to more layoffs in the gaming industry, fueled by boycotts that have to lie about the microtransactions to begin with. If you have to lie to make a point, it means your point wasn't strong enough to stand on its own. This entire situation was selective outrage and manufactured hate by the same exact people who wouldn't want to jeopardize the next Monster Hunter or Resident Evil game. If this point of view pisses you off, well, go ahead and hit that dislike button and go f*** yourself all the way off my channel.
Go yourself. Is that clear? I hope it is.
I don't do YouTube for a living, so go ahead and ratio away. And you sure as f*** aren't ever going to tell me what I can spend my own money on when I'm the one earning it.
Stop! He's already dead!
Now that my rant's over, let's actually talk about the game. So the story of Dragon's Dogma 2 opens up, you're a slave in a mining camp who quickly finds out that you're an Arisen. An Arisen is a human selected by the dragon, chosen to be given the chance to end the cycle by killing the dragon, or extending the cycle in your defeat. This is done by the dragon eating your heart, and turning you into basically a supernatural being bound to the dragon through this action.
From this moment forth, thou art arisen. Charge and all.
You quickly escape the slave camp and start learning about pawns, how the Arisen is tied to the dragon, and how fighting the dragon is now your life's defining purpose. The story set up, you being a prisoner with amnesia, it's pretty Bethesda, I know, and it doesn't really get much better than the basic Bethesda storyline, with a few exceptions. And most of those are specific to mechanics, but we'll get to that. It's not some new all-time classic fantasy story, just because it's told much more coherently than the first one. And I'll also admit the story of the first one was much better done once it all dumped on you 3/4 of the way through the game. There's really nothing special here story-wise. And I really do think it does a worse job of explaining the cycle and the philosophical questions that tie into ending the cycle towards the end of the game. But the story isn't what made the first one a classic, or had people like me coming back to it for over a decade. That's done just by how different this game is from anything else out there, and how unapologetic it is with its mechanics. Before I dive into that, my shameless plug. This video is sponsored by my day job. All views and opinions are my own. Likes and subs are appreciated, but don't hit the notification button. Does anybody actually even do that? Seems annoying. Don't do that. If you ask any fan of the first game what made them love it, most will tell you it just doesn't feel like anything else out there. And of course, the dynamic combat, those situations make for some amazing highlight reels. Next to the most satisfying action RPG combat I can even think of, what makes this franchise special to me is what people are simply calling friction. That's what I call the tough love progression. Everything in this game comes down to budgeting and commitment to your decisions. So let's talk about the combat first. You've probably seen all the crazy footage and trailers and wondered if it really played like that. And the answer is yes and no. It starts with your vocation. These are basically the game's class systems. You start out by choosing between the basic vocations of mage, archer, thief, or fighter, and as you level these classes and unlock active and passive skills, you unlock the warrior and sorcerer advanced vocations. Unlike the first game, the remaining advanced vocations are actually learned through various NPCs. Most of them aren't too difficult to find organically in a playthrough, but it is possible to miss out on some of them. You also get assigned the basic vocations and the 2 unlockable advanced vocations to your player-created pawn. Pawns are this game's version of a multiplayer component, and I use that loosely. Think more Death Stranding than Call of Duty. And your pawn can be recruited by anyone else to bring along on their journey. You go into what's called the Rift. Here you can choose how you want your party built by picking pawns with vocations that complement the ones you have for yourself and your own pawn. It doesn't cost anything to recruit one within a level or 2 of your own, but if you want to recruit one at a higher level so you don't have to swap out as often, you need to have specific currency. This is what's called Rift Crystals, and your main source of Rift Crystals comes from other players recruiting your pawn, and other players earn the same by you using theirs. You're meant to experiment with different vocations as you play. You'll notice how fast your vocation levels, and how fast you build up vocation points in combat. This is meant for you to swap not only your own, but your pawn's vocation too, and in turn swap out the pawns that you borrowed from the Rift. So you're going to set out with your group of pawns to general quest locations throughout the map. And as a lot of people have complained about, your first playthrough is intentionally going to have you walking back and forth, probably more than you're used to in a modern open world RPG. You're going to be extremely limited on your fast travel, especially in the opening hours. Another friction point based on budgeting your resources. Your fast travel starts out as only being able to use ox carts with the risk of being attacked on the road. Think the Morrowind travel system here, just with a little bit of risk added. These are extremely cheap fast travel points, but they're limited to going between specific towns. And at the beginning of the game, even cheap fast travel will be something you need to really think about because that gear upgrade might only be a couple hundred gold out of reach. Really early you'll open 2 permanent port crystals between 2 cities, but you'll also start to get your own placeable port crystals that you can put almost anywhere for mobile fast travel points. These require fairy stones to use, and those will also be very limited in the beginning of the game. You'll find several really early, but using them right away could leave you stranded out in the wilds later. The system opens up much more as you get later into the game, but it's another budgeting system the game expects of you right at the beginning. So inevitably, you're going to spend a lot of time walking around the open world with your party and fighting monsters. And you're going to feel completely overwhelmed by the ganks in the first few hours, especially when those dynamic combat scenarios begin to pop up. It's not at all uncommon to stumble on an ogre fighting a handful of goblins, and once you finally decide to hop into the fight, you're blindsided by a griffin that was circling overhead that you didn't even notice. Literally nowhere you try and go in the opening hours is going to be an easy to or from trip for any quest. Your carry weight also comes into this. Based on how you created your character and your pawn, it'll determine some of your starting stats. A larger character will have a higher carry weight capacity, but will burn through stamina faster and recover stamina slower. On the other hand, a small character will be faster on their feet and be able to climb monsters faster to target weak points. But they're also more likely to be knocked down by heavy attacks from an enemy, and when fighting 5 or 10 enemies at a time, that could be a death sentence. In the event of death, you have what's called wake stones that act as a revival mechanic. They'll refill your health all the way, but these are relatively limited early game also. They're much more common here than in the first game, but they're also needed if a main quest character dies and you want to continue that quest line, another budgeting requirement. Or you can choose not to use one and continue at the cost of a chunk of your recoverable health. As you take damage in fights, you lose more and more of the portion of your health bar that can actually be recovered through spells or consumables. The only way to get that full amount back is to rest at a camp or an inn, or use a wake stone when you die. So from how much gear you wear, to how many curatives you're carrying, to when or if you spend your gold on gear upgrades or another fairy stone, to how many creature parts needed for later upgrades you keep in storage or sell off to buy that next level of armor, everything outside of wake stones is really unforgiving in the beginning, especially to someone not familiar with how the game mechanics and gameplay loops are going to go. Specifically early game, everything is set up for experimentation and exploration. This game is the epitome of the saying, it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. The devs fully intend for wandering off the beaten path as you go on to your next quest point. If you beeline between quests, not only are you going to be horribly bored with this game, but you're going to miss out on the main experience of this franchise. This is something similar to Skyrim, where you might have a quest marker that you have to go to, but you're going to wander off and make your own story on the way there. This is where I'll end the gloss over of the basic mechanics, because like I said, part of the fun of this game is figuring out how all the mechanics intertwine and how you could specifically work them together with your own playstyle. Because this is definitely not a game for everyone. The friction term I mentioned, and what I call the tough love progression, is what made me fall in love with the first game. I picked it up completely at random and had never heard of it. And playing through something with such obscure and quirky mechanics, when there wasn't much online to walk you through it at the time, gave an experience that I've just never had with another game. I just had to figure it out on my own. I mentioned decisions you make and how it expects you to stick with them. I'm not talking about story-based decisions here. This is actually in the old school traditional sense. You have a single save file with one backup. This prevents you from save scumming. You have to consciously manage that backup in save, because that's the only way you're going back if something happens and you need to. You have a really small carry capacity at the beginning of the game, so if you make a huge character that can carry a bit more, you have to commit to the slower movement speed and stamina recovery, even down just to adjusting you and your pawn's appearance. It's all tied to the devs, holding you to your decisions from the start of the game. I'll admit they did make it a bit more approachable than the first game in a few ways. One being you can make adjustments to you and your pawn pretty early if you're paying attention. On top of that, the overall combat seemed a little bit easier than the last one, especially with the fairly common wake stones, even during the frustrating ganks at the beginning. Where this really gets into tough love progression is as you figure out how to game the economy and level up your character, things that were insanely tedious the first 10 hours or so start to become trivial. By endgame, I was slicing through the ganks, melting the dive-bombing griffins, and fast-traveling wherever I needed because I had budgeted to have an abundance of fairy stones. New Game Plus adds even more to this since you keep all your port crystals, fairy stones, wake stones, on top of being extremely overpowered for early and mid-game. I do think the lack of hard mode and the speedrun option that Dark Arisen added to the first game is a bit of a misstep here. Same with having to manually delete your save file if you wanted to start over at the launch. When I want it to be slow and methodical again, I'll start a new game. With all the complaints about how modern games follow this Ubisoft formula, Dragon's Dogma does what it wants and doesn't care what you think about it. And all the people complaining about it just go back to the next Ubisoft open world game just to complain about how all games start to feel the same. But it's not all sunshine and unicorn farts here, even for me. I don't at all consider the fast travel system, the lack of multiplayer, or even the single save slot a con, because these are all intentional design choices that I can appreciate for what they are and how they tie together. And they all carry over from the previous game, so I was prepared for what I was getting into right away. But there's definitely some cons to this game besides the main story. First off, the game at launch ran like absolute dog shit on PC. This is what was really lost in the noise about all the microtransactions, and it keeps getting lost for every single game release. From Elden Ring to Jedi Survivor to this. PC ports launching in unplayable states is never acceptable, and I'm getting a bit tired of everyone just accepting it and then crying about microtransactions. It's just the selective outrage over the microtransactions on games they don't care about, but this would be a valid reason to completely refuse to buy it at launch. I had minimal issues with frame drop on my first playthrough, and only once where it got really choppy going into a city. But other people have had far worse issues in the cities. I did try the option of capping it at 30 when the patch came out, but it played noticeably worse for me at that point, so I switched it back almost immediately. The second biggest thing I'd say is the lack of enemy variety. The first game had this issue too, but it feels even worse here because they dropped a couple larger enemies and upped the enemy density. I could even actually appreciate bringing the enemy density down from 100 to about 75, but I don't think that's the main problem. The problem is that you're fighting variants of the same enemies from almost the beginning till the end. Nothing to the extent of Banisher's lack of variety, but I also spent over 150 hours in this game at this point, and already started through New Game Plus too. I'll give adding in the Warfare class finally opens up a ton of options that I didn't consider on my first 2 runs, but I'm still fighting the same goblins, hobgoblins, Saurian variants, ogres, and minotaurs over and over and over. But for me, it's those dynamic combat moments that make it worth it, and a little bit of the funny frustration when all the pawns kamikaze off a cliff. All of this is going to bug a lot of people and relatively early playing through. There's also a certain level of jank here. I've heard it compared to Eurojank games, but it's nowhere near as bad. You'll still run into clipping issues in traversal every now and then. The interact prompt can be horribly finicky. The camera inside tight areas can be pretty frustrating, just like about every other third-person perspective. The soft lock targeting goes a little bit wonky sometimes, and your pawns do some insanely stupid stuff. Most of these are far less than the first game, but they're all still present here to some extent. And even with the frustration of the pawn AI, I still like that they do dumb shit at random. It runs along the same lines of how you laugh at Bethesda bugs. And then there's the quests themselves. While the story is more coherent for the most part, it kind of just wraps up and it's over. The general quest loop really boils down to basic fetch or fighting quests. That's both the main and the side quests. It's extremely Skyrim-ish for quest design, and something I don't personally consider a con at all, but I need to mention it because some people really took issue with it. You can completely miss certain quests, including some main story quests, if you aren't being meticulous. I didn't even like that they added in an icon to blatantly show you what missions were timed. I thought it was pretty common sense compared to the first game, and a bit too much of a handhold style. But I actually ended up skipping a couple quests that I thought were basic missions on my first playthrough, just to get to the end of the game and literally have no idea who the big bad was, or even how we got to the point we were at with him in the story. This was really only 2 or 3 quests that I skipped over, but they had huge story points in them that weren't filled in anywhere else along the line. I actually thought the story was just as disjointed as the first one until New Game Plus and I did those quests. It changed how the entire story played out for me. Not that it really made it good, it just tied it all together. I absolutely love that about the game. The fact that you're even allowed to miss main quest story beats like that, I think it's a great dev decision. But it'll be a huge issue for some people that don't like a game letting you miss major plot points. On the trophy front, this is much more direct and an easier platinum than the first game. It did take me until last year to get all the Dark Arisen trophies. You could completely do this in a single playthrough if you use a guide. But of all the games I don't recommend doing this for, this would be the biggest don't recommend. If you use a guide on Dragon's Dogma 2, you're going to streamline all of the exploration and wonder that keeps people going back for multiple playthroughs. Though it shouldn't take you even close to my current 150 hours to get the platinum, I would recommend at least giving the game a shot the way they intended you to play it first. Then maybe looking everything else up on a second run, and you could just blast through most of the game with fast travel being open and being OP for most fights. This is up to you, but this isn't going to be a fast platinum to begin with, and you're not going to get much out of the game using a guide like that. So at what price point would I really recommend picking this up at for anyone interested? Obviously, I love this game. I'm not sure yet if it'll stand the test of time for me the way the first one did or not, but there was no way I wasn't going to be playing this on release day. And generally, I don't even have an issue with AAA games costing $70. I definitely got my money's worth out of it, even if I never played it again. But I can't recommend it at launch price here in good faith. Even for a franchise that I hold up in my top 10, what this really comes down to is the fact that there are still PC performance issues, and there's even people having trouble with their saves on consoles. I completely appreciate the idea of a single save with a single backup, but if this is your design choice, it's completely inexcusable to have reliability issues with the saving. I didn't personally find too many glitches to speak of on my playthroughs, but I also know I have really good luck with glitches and performance with games. And as much as I absolutely love my time with this, and will probably end up finishing my 3rd playthrough here in the next couple weeks, I would recommend waiting until you find a sale around the $50 mark. I just can't recommend a full price for a game that's already naturally divisive, especially when the performance at launch is yet another example of launching before final QA of your game's complete. If you were really curious but not sure if you'd even like the mechanics, I'd actually recommend picking up Dark Arisen and giving it a run. The graphics are dated, especially in character models, but mechanically it's very similar. You can easily find it for under $10. And I say go on sale digitally for just a couple bucks all the time. If you play through that and fall in love enough to drop money on the sequel, I think you'll also get a bit more out of it just knowing how the cycles work and the lore that wasn't really explained as well in this game as it was late game in the first one. Let me know down in the comments if you already played through Dragon's Dogma 2 and what you ended up thinking about it. My channel is not Reddit, so keep it civil. But I'd really like to hear from people who never played the first one and what they ended up thinking about the second one. Until next time.
Greetings, Arisen. Hast thou summoned the resolution to face me?
What? Toodaloo, motherfucker. Hey.